I am so excited about my guest today. We've worked on projects together before, and he is just a serious well of knowledge and wisdom, especially in the area of marriage. Dr. Kim Kimberling has been a professional counselor for 37 years and married to his wife Nancy for 51 years. Together, they have 2 adult children and 5 awesome grandchildren. Dr. Kim's marriage wisdom is the result of years of experience, both personally and professionally. Welcome, Dr. Kim. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Monica. It's so good to be here and to get to spend some time with you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I always love chatting with you. And I just feel like
I feel the
everything
same
that
way.
comes out of your mouth is so much wisdom.
Now I feel pressure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've got my pen and pencil out or pen and paper out. So I hope that everybody is listening and taking notes. But why don't you start by telling us the 3 things that always matter in marriage?
Well, I kind of come at this out of the things that I see in counseling, and obviously one of them is communication. I was thinking yesterday, I've done a little deal on communication. I was thinking, I can't remember one single couple that has ever come into counseling that communication was not an issue in one way or another. So that is one of the things that's so important, because I think when you really see couples that communicate well, usually they would say they have a good marriage. It's a big factor. The other thing, and it's something that we see all the time, and it's finances. I've been counseling for over 35 years, and every survey on marriage I've seen over those years, finance is one of the problems that always comes up. And then I think the other thing that I love that couples are a lot more willing to talk about this, and that's their sexual relationship, because I think it's such a gift from God. And so I think those are things that I see couples struggle with. They fight about, cause conflict. And so to me, those are 3 things that if we get on top of those things are going to be much better in our marriage, our communication, our finances, and really embracing the sex relationship, not like the world does, but like God designed us to have.
Well, I am so excited that you're here to discuss all 3 of those things with us today. So, we'll just start with communication. When it comes to communication, what are some of the key things to remember, especially when talking about tough topics?
Yeah, I think that you've got to listen. I think that's the biggest problem. And I see it play out so many times early on in counseling as I'm learning about a couple, that you can just see that this one couple is telling their concerns, and the other person is not tuned in at all. They are just sitting there thinking about what they're going to say. As soon as my spouse quits talking, now I can give my side of it and still really listening. And so you're not going to resolve anything. You're not going to solve anything that way. So it comes to those tough topics. Maybe you're talking about finances. Maybe you're talking about, hey, we got to get a hold of our finances, or we got to get on top of our credit card bills. Well, when one person's talking, you've got to listen to them. You've got to try to empathize with them. You got to try to put yourselves in their shoes. And when you do that, I think it makes a huge difference. If Nancy and I are talking and she's telling me something and that I'm just distracted, or I'm not really listening well, and she finishes and say something that is totally off topic of what she was talking about, she's going to think you didn't hear anything. But if I do listen to her and I do say, hey, I do agree with you, I do think that's something we need to talk about, or I do think here's a problem, let's work on together, then we've connected, and then we began to take that step to work on things together. And so I think a lot of times we focus so much on our words. I just want to say this right. And all those things are pretty important, because you've got to be in some ways a student of your spouse. So, if I'm talking in a high voice, Nancy hears nothing I'm saying. So I know if I really want her to hear something that's important, I've got to keep my voice at a normal level. And I've got to I've got to look her in the eye. I've got to, all those kind of things that help her connect with me. And so I think all those things are important, but the listening, if you listen well and you listen to try to really understand your spouse, it makes a huge difference. I've had a lot of couples, when they really learn to communicate well, they don't have as much conflict, because they've listened to each other, and they're learning about each other. And so a lot of times when we do that, it resolves a lot of the issues they have, just because we took the time to listen and try to understand our spouse.
Do you think some of those exercises like echoing or making sure that we're um, reiterating like, this is what I heard you say, is that correct? Like those types of things really help.
I think they do. I think it's a way, and some people think, "Oh my gosh, that's kinda bland," or whatever, a little uncomfortable, and I think it can be at first. We use a thing called stop, look, listen, and it really is when you're talking about something important to stop everything else you're doing, get the distractions out of the way, put your phone where you can't reach them, all those kind of things. When I'm in counseling with somebody and one of them picks up the phone and looks at it in the middle of a counseling session, that didn't go over very well with the other spouse. So, you got to really stop what else you're doing to look. Nancy and I, when we're talking, it's important to us to look face to face, to be where we're sitting facing each other. One, for me, it blocks out distractions because I can be easily distracted. And two, it helps me to listen better to her. And then the last part is stop, look, and listen, really listen to what they're saying. And then I think part of that is what you were saying there is to give them feedback. This is what I think I heard you say. And it gives you a chance to clarify too, because I may hear something very different than she wants, than she intends it to be. So it gives me to say, okay, this is what I think you're saying, or this is what I think you want me to do. Is that right? Or to affirm what they're saying, but somehow where you can respond back to that. And then I think that begins to get the conversation going and you're able to engage at that time. And so I think, yeah, anything to let the other person know that you really heard what they said is really important, really a big step.
Yeah, that also I think would take away the tendency to think about what you're going to say next. If you're really trying to like, okay, I'm going to have to say what I heard, then you're not like, you know, working on
Yes.
your response while they're talking.
Yeah, there's a research thing that I've read years ago, and I'm sure it's still true, maybe even more true, but it says you can listen 5 times faster than someone can talk. So when your spouse is talking to you, you've got some extra time in there. And so you can let your mind wander or you can think about what you're going to say, but that's not going to work. And so you have to really be intentional about really listening to what they're saying. And so I think if we can learn to do that and do it because we want to resolve whatever we're talking about, we want our spouse to feel respected and honored and that we make things important to us that are important to them. And I think that's a big point too, that if it's important to Nancy, I've got to make it important to me. I might have never thought of it in my whole life, but if it's important to her, I've got to make it important to me because we live together. We're having a marriage. And if I discount her or discount the things that are important to her, well, that's not going to draw her close to me. That's going to make her think, well, I'll go talk to somebody else about this. I'll go talk to my girlfriends. I'm not going to talk to you about this. And that's not what I want in my marriage. I want my wife to be able to come to me. And I think that's really what we all want. We want that connection that is there so that we're each other's first choice to talk about anything.
Yeah, so good. So, how can we change the way we're communicating with our spouse if our current systems are clearly not working for us?
I think one is just saying this isn't working. Just acknowledging because the old insanity thing of doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. And I think sometimes we do that. Okay, this is the way I talk to the people at work, and they get me. Why don't you get me? Well, one, she doesn't work for you, or he doesn't work for you, and I think sometimes we do that too. What works in the workforce, we try to do at home, and that doesn't work at all. And so, I think we have to say, okay, we need to do something different. And I think you sit down together. I think, sit down together. And if you need to go to counselor to begin to do that, that's great. I mean, that's very much money well spent to begin to do that. But I think you don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over. It's time to say, okay, we're not communicating well. We're not listening well. We're not understanding each other. We're not near as close as we were a year ago because of that in many ways. And so then, okay, well, then what's our next step? And so many couples that do come in for counseling, one of the presenting problems usually is communication. We don't really get each other anymore, because usually you don't think about that when you're dating because you do get each other or you're trying to get each other. You're working hard at it. The guy's trying to get a ring on her finger and get her to say, I do. And so, you're communicating ways that you didn't even know you could communicate. And so sometimes then we get in marriage and we think, well, that's done. Well, no, that's just the beginning. And so I think we kind of quit working at it sometimes. But sometimes I'll take couples back to how did you communicate before marriage? And most of the time, they will say they communicated pretty well before marriage because they were taking time for each other. They were listening to each other. They were caring for each other. And so it kind of get them there and say, okay, how do we bring that forward? How do we do that? And maybe refine it some if we need to, but to get you back where your communication connects you and makes you feel closer instead of making you want to go in the other room and not even be around each other.
Yeah, well, that's my next question. What happens when one partner stops communicating because they feel like their spouse doesn't listen or care what they have to say?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, that is hard. And I get it sometimes because you just, I've had people that the husband or wife just feels like they keep setting themselves up. I want them to listen, so I'm going to be vulnerable again. And then they just don't get heard anymore. So I think it's one of those things to say, hey, um, can we go to counseling together? Can we go to counseling? And because I want us to communicate better. I don't think you're listening to me. And maybe I'm doing things I'm not aware of that I'm doing. And I think we need to start something. So I think it's just, can we take a step there that's going to get us to where we need to go in communicating and not just let that continue, because it's easy to shut down. And I've seen couples that do that. I mean, they just don't communicate. You exist together, you can live together. There's couples that sometimes they don't fight all the time, but they don't communicate and they don't connect, and they're just kind of doing business under the same roof. And that's not really what a marriage is all about. So, I mean, I think looking for those red flags and not let them get redder, address them and say, hey, I love you. I want this marriage to work. Can we take a step toward getting this communication better?
Yeah, so good. Let's switch gears here and talk about, how do you suggest couples communicate about their finances? How can they set up a system where both the spender, because I notice when people struggle with their finances, usually there's a spender and there's a saver, and
Yeah.
both of them feel like they're going head to head all the time. So, how can they set up a system where they both feel like they're getting their needs met?
Yeah, and I think that's really pretty much true. We use an assessment and it kind of defines them as spender or saver. Most of the time they're different. One's a spender, one's a saver. Sometimes they'll be spenders, and that's another issue. And then sometimes both are savers. But I think what you want to do is, the way I approach it is, okay, what are your goals with your finances? And really, in the big picture, to look at it, it's all from God anyway. And if we can look at, he's the owner and we're the managers, then I think it helps redefine that. I think budgets are really good. I think some people shy away from budgets because they look like, oh, it's going to handicap me. But I think you can really use a budget to help your relationship. In other words, if you have a budget and you've got money set aside for each one of you to spend however you want every month, well, then you don't have to. Then the one who likes to spend more um, can spend it and not feel bad about it. Well, that was in our budget. And the one who likes to save, they may save for a year and then buy something really, really cool or something big with it. So I think it's trying to figure out, okay, you're probably not going to change each other. Maybe you can refine that some. And so the spender becomes a little more responsible than they were when they're single. The saver is able to see the value and say in spending, and maybe this is something that's going to be good for our home, or things like that, or something my spouse wants. But to realize that there is an answer there, and we don't have to fight about money all the time. Every time that you come home with something, you don't have to worry about, where am I going to hide this till, so my spouse doesn't see it. And then you put on that outfit and then you wear it, and the spouse says, is that? And you go, no, I've had this a long time. I can't believe you don't remember. Well, that's not, that's not going to help much either. So I think talking about finances, getting that concept of it really is God's, and how do we manage this? Having a guideline or a budget that gives you some flexibility and freedom in your spending, all those things I think will help you eliminate some of that conflict that the couples have in finances.
Yeah. So, what's the best way to bring up concerns about finances? Like if someone continues to overspend or, isn't following the budget, how do you bring that up in a way that doesn't really shatter something?
Yeah, because I think we usually, when we see that and it's something we've talked about, we get angry. And so that is the worst time to talk about it, because it's not going to go anywhere. It's just not going to resolve anything. And so I think it's saying to your spouse, hey, we've talked about this 3 or 4 months in a row and we're not getting there. Can we sit down? When's a good time for you? Let's sit down and let's really talk this through. See if we can come up with something that works. And maybe in that conversation, I've had it where one says, you've got $300 a month for groceries and we got 4 kids. I can't do it. And yes, I'm going over a month, but I'm trying to do as well as I can. I'm trying to meal plan. I'm trying to do these things. So where you see me going over in this area, it's because I'm really just doing the best I can with the kids. And so then they can say about, well, okay, so we had this money budgeted for something and we really don't need that right now. Let's put that in over in our food budget for a period of time and do that. So you begin to communicate on it and try to understand each other. Because sometimes I think we make assumptions, or we think that, well, she's just going to the grocery store and she's just buying everything she wants. And, instead of realizing that our spouse may really be working hard at doing some things. Now, if someone's just a frivolous spender, that's a different story. And I think then that's something where you can have to, yes, have a conversation, but that may be where you want to go to a financial expert and say, hey, our long-term goals, a lot of times couples can agree on long-term goals. We want money for retirement, things like that. And then a financial planner can kind of help you back up and say, okay, if you want to have this when you retire, here's some things you need to do now. And sometimes it comes much better from someone else and someone that helps you see the bigger picture in that. And so it helps to invite someone that like that in sometimes too, I think.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed with people and their kind of money mindsets is it's pretty deeply ingrained from childhood experiences and things like that. So if you're just looking at the behavior, like somebody's a saver and they just you can't understand why they're so crazy, like we have this money, why can't we spend it,
Yeah.
right? It's like so good to just step back and be like, what were your experiences growing up, or what causes you to be so,
Mhm.
you know, feel so strongly about these types of things when I don't
Absolutely.
understand it, right? And so I think you can open up conversations like that and really try to understand where your partner is coming from when it comes to do with money, because there's so many things I think we experience as children that we don't really understand how it comes out as an adult in,
Right.
in our money, practices and things until somebody starts asking about it and they go, oh, I remember when we were so poor, we had to split a candy bar six.
Yeah.
And so that's why I always like want to have this rainy day fund or whatever it is like
Sure.
that. It helps to really understand where your partner is coming
And to
from.
take the time to do that. Yeah. One of my favorite questions to ask couples in premarital is what was money like in your family growing up? And
Mhm.
so they can, and sometimes you're just not even aware of it sometime because that was your normal. And then one says one way and the other says another. Well, no wonder you guys are having trouble with money because your experiences growing up were totally different. Now we got to decide what you guys want for your marriage and what's going to work for you, because you can't blend those two together. You've got to come up with something that works for the two of you. So yeah, family of origin, and probably in everything we're talking about, whether it was the communication we started with, a lot of those things, family of origin has a big impact on that. And sometimes, sometimes family of origin is really good and really has some good things for us. But there's other things sometimes, that messages that come that we don't even realize we're getting, that really are going to cause some problems later on in our marriages.
Yeah, so good to try and understand those things. So,
Hmm.
why do you think sex is such a tough topic for couples?
It's so interesting. I do feel like couples are talking more about it in counseling and bringing it up more than they did probably 10 or 15 years ago, which is great because I think it's something we need to talk about. I think sometimes they don't know how to talk about it. Couples, usually the fights that they have are not healthy. That, if they're talking about frequency and they're arguing about frequency, or the problem with the thing, like, say, example with frequency, is usually when they talk about it is when one of them's frustrated. And so that's not going to go very far. And so sometimes maybe they have tried to talk about sex and it just hadn't gone well. And so I think that's where a counselor can really help them kind of walk through that and talk about, what do you want out of your sex life? And then I think you have different ideas. You have male, female, and, guys come into marriage and sometimes think their wife is going to have the same sex drive they do. And a lot of times that doesn't happen. Or I think the end goal for both in sex is usually the same, of connecting and enjoying that and the passion that goes with it, but how they get there is real different. And so I think we've got to take the time to just accept some of those differences and know that if we're going to have a healthy sex life, I've got to value what Nancy thinks, what she wants, what's important to her in that, and her for me too. And so you begin to communicate on it. But I think people don't talk about it because they just haven't done a good job of talking about it in the past. They probably didn't have it modeled. And most people don't have really good sex education when they're growing up, you know. Uh, my mom, the only sex talk I got was my mom driving me to school one day. and and I just remember she finished, I was probably sixth or seventh grade. And I guess she thought, okay, this is the time I've got him for 15 minutes or something like that. And looking at it when we got to school and said, Mom, you really blew that and getting out of school, out of the car. So I think a lot of it is we learn about sex through our culture, and that doesn't really give us, I think, the plan that God has for sex, the gift that it is, and knowing that God gives us so much leeway in the sexual relationship to really enjoy each other. And you read through Song of Solomon, and it's very, very clear that this couple is enjoying each other in a physical sexual relationship. And so it is God's plan, and God's not a prude. And that, that's where some people I think get stuck sometimes too.
Yeah. So, how can couples set up open and honest communication about their desires and differences and drives?
Yeah, I think one thing I like to do with couples is really just have them list out the things that are really important to them in a sexual relationship with their spouse in marriage. And then have them say they get 7 or 8 things on their list, and then have them rate them each one 1 to 10. And then we come together and we look at, okay, let's look at our tens. What are those? Is it common? Are they two different things? And how would you like that need met? And so they can begin to communicate on that. Because I think when a couple can get to the point and say, if we really try to understand each other and we're working our sex life together, it's really going to be better for both of us. And I think realizing that there are different seasons, when we had 5 years before we had kids. Well, we had a lot of freedom in that time. We were together a lot. We didn't have to worry about kids or those kind of things. And then we get into having a couple of kids, and then that changed our sex life for that time. One, because Nancy was tired, we'd go on a date and I'd take the babysitter home and come back, she'd be asleep. And it's like, okay, this didn't used to happen when we didn't have kids. And so I think we've realized there's different seasons, and that it's okay to make some adjustments for that season and to decide, what is our frequency, what works for both of us in this season, and then not to compare yourself to other couples because they may be in a different season, they may see things differently. But I think just willing to talk about it and to adjust as you go from one season to another, and knowing we want to make this as good as we can for this season, but it may be different than it was the last season we're in or the next one that we're in. So I think that helps a lot.
Yeah. So, what would you say is your best advice to couples regarding sexual intimacy and how to make it enjoyable for both parties?
I think it's to get rid of our selfishness. It's really, how do I serve you in this? How do I make this so good for you? And then your spouse is saying, how do I make this good for you? And when you're working on it together like that, it throws out a lot of the junk that I think sometimes gets in, and that you really are trying to serve each other, and you're trying to make this good. And you're trying to make this everything that God intended it to be for your marriage. And so I think, and it's to be talking about that, what's our sex relationship? What do we want it to look like? And, I had a couple that they had 4 kids, and for a period of time, their sexual relationship was morning showers together. But that was the only time they could lock themselves in the bathroom and get away from kids. But they talked about that, and they said, we want our sex life to be good. And the wife said, when we're in bed and the kids are in bed, and I just don't feel as comfortable. So they worked out something, and then they would take a night out or overnight, once a month or once a quarter or something like that. But I think it's just communicating about it and figuring out something that's going to work for you, work for both of you who you are at this point.
Yeah, so good. So, this is my favorite question, but how does good communication about finances and sex and everything else benefit your children and future generations?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we don't realize we talked earlier about the impact our home life, our family origin has on our kids. So I think when our kids see us communicating well, when they see us, talking, maybe somebody lose a job. I had a great couple that they went through 2 job losses from him over about an 8-year period. And they were, their kids saw them work together. They saw them make a new budget that worked for where they were. They talked to their kids about there's some things we're going to have to do different over this time. Dad will work again, but right now we don't, he he doesn't have a job right now. And so I think you can teach them through all those kind of things. And I think it's important to know that you're affectionate with each other. I think it's to know that that is an important part of your life. Now, they learn different things as they get older, but I think Nancy and I wanted our kids to know that that was an important part of our lives, and that was a gift God gave us, and that was something we wanted them to have in their marriages in the future. So I think it really gives you an opportunity to talk about those, to really have sex talks with your kids about, this is maybe you're a couple that didn't wait till you're married to have sex, and so you say, we at some age, it probably appropriate to say, we didn't, we wish we did, or that we did, and this is why we see the value of it. And so it opens up those conversations because all of us want our kids to have healthy marriages when they grow up. We want them to have good sex life. We want to have them, know how to communicate well and how to handle their finances in a way that's gonna help their marriage. And so all those things I think really make a difference. And it's just really being willing to work on those things and then letting your kids in as it's as appropriate in all those conversations because you're teaching them and you want to teach them well.
Yeah, so good. Well, thank you again, Dr. Kim, for your time today. This has been really just beneficial. I think that people will get some good value out of our conversation today. Can you tell the listeners where they can find more information about you, where they can find you on Instagram and all your fun reels and
Sure.
all the wonderful things that you do?
We have a lot of great things. AwesomeMarriage.com is kind of a gateway to everything. We have Awesome Marriage Podcast that's available everywhere. I think AwesomeMarriage.com will lead you to all of those.
Well, thank you again so, so much.
Thank you.
To learn more ways to deepen your intimacy and strengthen your relationship, make sure you watch this video next